Hello, I'm Rebecca J. Thompson. Thank you for watching my video presentation, The Window Opens on a World of Wonder and Beauty, Windows as the Eyes of the Soul in Ellen Montgomery's fiction. For Montgomery, windows are not only physical places for sight and protection, but also symbolic places for dreaming and visions. Examining Montgomery's Prince Edward Island journals and four of her novels, Anne of Green Gables, Emily of New Moon, Jane of Lantern Hill, and Pat of Silver Bush, reveals fascinating patterns in the use of window imagery. Windows are threshold spaces connecting the domestic interior with nature. They also provide a portal to facilitate connection to innermost feelings and dreams, and are essential beacons representing home, family, and safety. While all three aspects often intertwine, this presentation will look at each separately to illustrate the ways Montgomery uses windows to connect interior spaces to exterior spaces, both physically and spiritually. Scholars such as Rosemary Ross Johnston, Irene Gammel, Val Czerny, and Laura Higgins have referenced the significance of windows to Montgomery and in Montgomery's work, and Elizabeth Epperly explores windows at some length in her book Through Lover's Lane. However, there is less in-depth analysis of Montgomery's use of windows than might be expected considering its prevalence throughout her journals and novels. In her book, Spatial Dynamics and Female Development in Victorian Art and Novels, Creating a Woman's Space, Liana F. Piehler uses art and literary criticism to explore window imagery, particularly in women's creative work. Begum Ozden Firat examines window metaphors in her chapter Looking Through Metaphors from the Window Towards the Threshold, and Georg Simmel's work on the door, which he connects briefly to windows, offers useful commentary on the liminal nature of threshold spaces. While Gaston Bachelard doesn't speak much on windows in his seminal work, The Poetics of Space, he does talk at length of juxtaposed elements of space and the places where spaces intersect. Each of these provides useful language for framing this discussion. Montgomery and her characters remain connected to the outer world of nature, even from within the domestic sphere of the house through their access to windows. When discussing Victorian paintings, Piehler suggests that including outdoor exterior spaces in a domestically set painting creates a spatial tension, both in terms of composition and of vista or perspective for the central female figure. Montgomery creates similar tensions in her characters who, even in the most domestic of scenes, are often also looking out the window, expanding their view. Anne daydreams out the window when memorizing the Lord's Prayer. Anne, Pat, and Emily escape the tedium of school through gazing into nature. Jane flies to the moon or to the island, and Emily literally escapes the spare room through the window. As Epperly says, the beloved house of home, the place for dreaming, is always in relationship to and in negotiation with the permanent force of nature and the changing beauty of nature. Anne articulates the importance she places in the way her window connects her with the natural world when she tells Diana, "I'm so glad my window looks east into the sun rising. It's so splendid to see the morning coming up over those long hills and glowing through those sharp fir tops. It's new every morning, and I feel as if I washed my very soul in that bath of earliest sunshine." Anne connects the world of nature with her spiritual well-being, and the window is the vehicle by which nature can be brought inside. For Pat, every window of Silver Bush was loved for some special bit of beauty to be seen from it. Every window connects Pat to the land she loves and helps ground her in who she is and where she belongs. Johnston argues that for Pat, landscape is personal, and precious, in some ways so much a part of her belonging that it is something owned. After the death of her father, Emily says goodbye to her bedroom window in the little brown house, a window which always seemed to Emily to open on a world of wonder. A line Montgomery borrowed from her own 10th of July, 1898 journal entry. Her focus as she leaves is memories of the various facets of nature accessible to her through that window. In her first night at New Moon, Emily's dismay at sharing a room with Aunt Elizabeth is compounded by the lack of access to the outside world. She misses her father, and tied to that is her loss of the dancing friendliness of well-known stars shining down through her open window. Emily is overwhelmed with a sense of loss until she hears the Wind Woman, after which her soul suddenly escaped from the bondage of Aunt Elizabeth's stuffy featherbed and gloomy canopy and sealed windows. The window, even closed, provides a connection with nature, which frees her soul and provides a sense of comfort. In Jane of Lantern Hill, Jane and her father reject several potential houses because of defects in the windows. But every view from Lantern Hill's windows is a delight. They overlook the Gulf and the harbor, and Jane's window is so close to nature she could almost have touched the top of the steep little hill from it. Later, trapped in the urban setting of 60 Gay Street, Jane longs for her own dear room where a young birch was fairly poking an arm in through the window from the steep hillside. When windows open into the harshness of cityscapes instead of the nature of countrysides, they don't provide the same sense of escape or openness. Yet even in these urban settings, Montgomery's heroines seek out what nature is available to them through the window portal, whether real or imagined. When working in Halifax, Montgomery is depressed by the dingy, hideous backyard upon which she gazes daily, commenting, "Really, I think it is the ugliest place in the world. It actually hurts me to look at it," and determining instead, "I will shut my eyes and imagine I am at my little gable window at home." In a similar way, Anne draws a sharp contrast between her own white room at Green Gables, where she would have the pleasant consciousness of a great green still outdoors, of a vast starry sky, and her boarding house in Charlottetown, where outside of her windows is a hard street with a network of telephone wires shutting out the sky. Pat's initial response to Charlottetown is like Anne's. During her first night, Pat runs to the window and then closes her eyes to shut out the buildings and train, instead imagining how the moon would be shining down on the secret field now, the little rabbits would be sitting on the paths among the birches, and thinks of her room missing her. For both Anne and Pat, the city is only a temporary living space, relieved often by weekend trips home. This isn't the case for Jane, who is often dreadfully lonely in Toronto, a fact immediately punctuated by a note that the tall windows rattled drearily and the big house seemed full of unfriendly noises and whispers. Her main escape into nature before her summer on the island is her dream life on the moon. On the moon, Jane is busy and happy, two things she never truly is in Toronto. Jane's first impulse upon returning to her unfriendly bedroom after that first summer is to open the window where a wind was trying to blow. Jane felt sorry for it, checked here, thwarted there, but it was blowing from the west. Would it blow right down to the island, to the velvety black night starred with harbor lights beyond Lantern Hill? Jane leaned out of the window and sent a kiss to Dad on it. The home she loves is far away, yet the window offers a hint of the nature that sustains her, including a wind which connects her to Dad and her true self that is so constricted in the city. Windows provide portals not only from the interior of the house to the exterior world of nature, but also from the exterior world to the interior sense of self. Firat states that the window metaphor brings forth a discourse of transparency that refers to perceptual and conceptual clarity and intelligibility in the relation between viewer and image. The window facilitates perceptual and conceptual clarity for Montgomery, and therefore for her heroines. In her journals, Montgomery connects her creative, writing, and dreaming self specifically with her window. On the 23rd of August, 1901, she writes, "I love spinning stories, and I love to sit by the window of my den and shape some airy fancy into verse." Internal and external vision connect at the liminal space of the window. Gammel says the sights, scents, and sounds that entered through the window animated her writing, sparking memory and emotion and daydreams. Just as that window opened vision for her, so Montgomery makes windows places where her heroines can gaze beyond themselves, both physically and spiritually. For many of Montgomery's characters, windows become loci for growth of mind and spirit, where they use the liminal space to begin crossing the threshold between girlhood and womanhood. Anne regularly communes at her window, but there are distinctive and particularly significant window moments at the end of Anne of Green Gables. As Czerny posits, Anne's journey involves a myriad of windows for Anne to step through in order to enter a state of presence that is outside of the familiar inert spaces. The first window moment takes place after her final talk with Matthew upon returning from Queens. The narrator tells us Anne always remembered the silvery, peaceful beauty and fragrant calm of that night. After Marilla tells Anne of the impending loss of Green Gables, the narrator returns us to this window scene to illustrate the contrast. How sadly things had changed since she had sat there the night after coming home. Then she had been full of hope and joy, and the future had looked rosy with promise. Anne felt as if she had lived years since then, but before she went to bed there was a smile on her lips and peace in her heart. She had looked her duty courageously in the face and found it a friend, as duty ever is when we meet it frankly. Johnston states that this moment at the window includes a looking outwards that constitutes a deep looking inwards, and a deep peace related to a decision about home. In both scenes, Anne uses the vision space of the window to look within herself, finding hope and strength to go after her dreams, even as those dreams change. Pat's moment is quieter and less driven by external impetus. One night, while staying with Bets, she wakes and goes to the window, where she gazes out and recalls a piece of poetry. She repeated it to herself with a strange, deep, exquisite thrill of delight, such as she had never felt before, something that went deeper than body or brain and touched some inner sanctum of being of which the child had never been conscious. Perhaps that moment was, for Patricia Gardiner, the soul's awakening of the old picture. All her life she was to look back to it as a sort of milestone, that brief, silvery vigil at the dormer window of the long house. This quiet moment of soul growth is one that Montgomery draws special attention to and is directly tied to vision afforded by a window. Grief and perturbation of spirit also lead Montgomery and her heroines to windows. At times, the window provides comfort, but often the disruption of internal equanimity disrupts their physical and spiritual view. On the 24th of July, 1899, after receiving news of the death of Herman Laird, Montgomery writes, "That night, when all the house was still, I knelt down by my window and, looking out into the dim, fragrant summer night, alight with calm stars, tried to realize that at that very moment, Herman Laird was lying in his coffin, cold and silent." The dark stillness both comforts her and forces her to face her loss. Emily, Anne, and Pat turn to windows after the death of a loved one as well. Emily curls up near the window of her bedroom after the death of her father, but none of the nature outside has any charm or consolation for her now. However, the beauty of the sunrise gives her strength to say her last goodbye and endure the funeral. Anne also can't find comfort from the window or nature in her grief after Matthew's death. She feels the weight of tears, but no tears came at first, even when she knelt by her window in the darkness and prayed, looking up to the stars beyond the hills. A short while later, though, the window allows Anne to see hope for her future, as discussed in the previous section. Pat does not lose her father, but her best friend, Bets. In the sick room, immediately after Bets has died, Pat looks out the window and describes a glorious view, but it holds no charms, and she wished sickly that she could get back into last year. There were no nightmares there. After going home, she tries to sleep, but the wind at the window was no longer a friend. It was a malignant thing. This is the first great loss of Pat's life, and she temporarily loses peace with herself and her surroundings, as well as her vision of the future, which had been tied tightly to her plans with Bets. Jane does not face a death, as Emily, Anne, and Pat do, but she does face the potential loss of her father to divorce. After reading Aunt Irene's letter, Jane goes blindly to her bedroom window, but finds no solace there. In fact, nature becomes threatening. The darkness outside the window seemed to look in at her menacingly. Once Jane had thought the rain and the wind were friends of hers, but they seemed enemies now. Everything hurt her. Everything in her life seemed uprooted and withered. Her sense of safety is threatened, and she cannot see clearly. Arriving at Lantern Hill, she sees her father through the kitchen window and shortly thereafter learns the rumor is untrue. When she wakes days later after her illness, the first thing she truly sees is the gulf sparkling and the sky so softly, so ethereally blue over the haunted dunes. Her internal vision has cleared, and so too has her vision of beauty through the window, a vision punctuated by the sound of her parents' reconciliation and the knowledge that they will all build a true home together. Windows provide connection to the exterior world of nature and development of the internal self. But when connected with home, windows are often viewed from outside rather than inside. Simmel states that the teleological emotion with respect to the window is directed almost exclusively from inside to outside. It is therefore looking out, not for looking in. Although the window representing home is often viewed from outside, this argument holds true, as Montgomery and her characters are looking at the light and life pouring out of the window toward them, with their desire or goal to enter the home so they too can look out. Montgomery doesn't often write of her own home or room from the outside, but many of the photographs included in her journals are of the outside of houses with windows marked and labeled to represent the people found within. While landscapes are important, they are centered around, as Johnson says, the idea of home and the powerful associations of coming home, finding home, and making home are part of her ideology of home as ontological beingness. It is a concept of space and relationship. Lights in the windows are especially significant because they represent the life taking place inside the house, the lives using and creating the light. This is particularly true in Pat of Silverbush. She loves to stand outside of Silverbush after dark and look at its lighted windows. Because of Pat's intense anthropomorphism of Silverbush, the lighted windows are a comfort in and of themselves, but each light also signifies the inhabitants. The house is such a nice, friendly house, but for Pat, the lights in the windows and the people represented by those lights make it a lovely home. For Jane, who never feels at home on Gay Street, the lights in the houses around Lantern Hill are comforting because each one has its own special significance. After discovering the house in Lakeside Gardens, the thing that bothers Jane the most is that there should be a light in the house behind her. She should be turning the lights on in it. In fact, once she realizes that she and her parents can live together as a family again, it is the idea of the windows coming to life in that house that makes her happiness complete. Because window lights represent life, Montgomery uses darkened windows to illustrate loss and death. After her grandmother's death, Montgomery mourns the loss of the house, her room, and specifically her window. She punctuates that passage with a photograph of my old window and poignantly describes how the house's home light is quenched forever, since for the first time, perhaps since it was built, certainly for the first time in her recollection, no light shone out from its windows through the old trees. The soul of the home was gone. This soul is represented by the lights, but is bound up in the people she has lost, her mother, father, grandfather, and grandmother. Pat's greatest loss is foreshadowed by the darkness of a window. Early in the novel, as she watches home lights spring up around her, she draws attention to one house in which there was never any light. Each lighted window represents life, but the one that will be Bet's window is dark. When the Wilcoxes move in, for the first time in her recollection, a light shone down from its windows that night, and Pat is overjoyed. Although they have several beautiful years of friendship together, Bet's early death leaves Pat in darkness for a time. The night after Bet's death, Pat wakes and looks out, but there is no light in Bet's window. Later, after the Wilcoxes sell their home, Bet's room was always dark. The perpetual darkness of Bet's window is representative of the loss of light and friendship, and in many ways, the loss of Pat's sense of safety. However, most of the time, Montgomery's windows are alive with light and a sense of home. In addition to representing the lives of those inside, windows viewed from the outside represent homecoming and safety. A light in the window, or simply the sight of a window itself, can be significant. Emily's loss at leaving her home after her father's death is ameliorated by her flash coming from the sudden glimpse of the dear, friendly little dormer window peeping through vines on the roof as they approach new moon. That window glimpse provides her first intimation of home. Jane has a similar experience when coming to Lantern Hill for the first time, when the upstairs window in its gable end winks at her over the top of the hill. This winking window draws a stark contrast to the description of Gay Street, where the tall, shuttered, blinded windows could never have thought of winking at anybody. The wink creates a welcoming feeling, one not experienced in years at her grandmother's house. In addition, during her first night at Lantern Hill, Jane dreams that her window is a magic window, where she will see her mother coming up that road looking for the lights of Lantern Hill. She imagines the home light she is casting will guide her mother back where she belongs. It's interesting that Anne's moment comes after her apology to Mrs. Lynde rather than at her first sight of Green Gables. Though Anne doesn't know it at the time, her first arrival is not a homecoming. Anne's insulting of Mrs. Lynde, followed by the test of wills and the resolution, solidifies Anne's place in the family, the relationship between her and Marilla, as well as her and Matthew, and brings a sense of homecoming upon their return to Green Gables. As she and Marilla walk up the road, far up in the shadows, a cheerful light gleamed out through the trees from the kitchen at Green Gables. Anne takes Marilla's hand and says, "It's lovely to be going home and know it's home. I love Green Gables already, and I never loved any place before. No place ever seemed like home." The sight of the Green Gables lights emphasizes Anne's sense of comfort and belonging. Montgomery repeatedly connects windows to life, whether that is the life of the people creating the light, the inner life, or the life found in nature. These are often intertwined as her characters return to their windows for solace, dreaming, and a sense of home. Montgomery herself punctuates her journals with descriptions and photographs of windows. They were clearly significant to her, and in return are of great significance to her heroines. While I've only looked at 4 of Montgomery's novels and the first 2 volumes of her collected journals, the pattern of window imagery is startling. For the sake of time, I've only touched on a few examples of the many I found. Additional research is sure to uncover even more uses of window imagery and other connections between characters in seemingly disparate circumstances through the liminal space of the window. Thank you.